coming everywhere. So prepare, say a prayer, send the word, send the word.
This is the third lecture in a series of 10 that we're having to commemorate the 100th anniversary of World War I. I just want to acknowledge some of our donors. This series has received funding from the New Jersey Historical Commission, the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History, who also contributed this traveling exhibit. So you can take a look at this, and I think some panels are outside. In addition, we thank the Library of America and the National Endowment of the Humanities. I hope that after today's talk, you'll take a moment to complete a survey that we'll pass around about today's lecture. In addition to Jack O'Brien, World War II veteran, we have the commander of American Legion Post 107, John Carey, in the back with Bob Cappiello. Thank you, Commander Carey. I'd just like to say that American Legion Post 107 was founded in 1921. It's one of the state's oldest continuously operating posts in the state. Today's historian, Thomas Fleming, is a bit of a hometown boy. He's born and raised in Jersey City and is a graduate of St. Peter's Prep. His father was an Irish-American World War I hero, and he appears regularly on PBS, A&E, and the History Channel. He is the author of this book, which amazingly enough is available for sale in our gift shop, and I'm sure that Mr. Fleming will be happy to autograph it for you after today's talk. I just want to say that we have another World War I talk coming up on November 6th. It's Professor Jeffrey Salmons, and he is going to be speaking on Harlem's Rattlers and the Great War, and that's about the African-American contingent that fought in World War I. So without further ado, today's historian, Mr. Thomas Fleming.
As I said to Eileen, I feel like I'm almost home in Hoboken. Many's the night my friends and I would come over to the Clambroth house, and we spent wonderful evenings in Hoboken. It was a town where we always had a lot of fun. And then there was Stevens Tech. My first cousin went there, and then my best friend, Jack Sweeney, he went there too. And I used to come over for various things that were happening there. So, as I say, Hoboken is almost home. And of course, Frank Sinatra. He made it almost home for everybody. Well, the title of my talk is Illusions and Realities in World War II. In World War I, excuse me. Ooh. I haven't lost it that much. When I decided to write a book on the American experience in World War I thought I discovered the best opening for an historical narrative I'd seen in 40 years of writing books. On the night of April 1, 1917, only hours before Woodrow Wilson was scheduled to go before Congress and ask for a declaration of war, the president sent for Frank I. Cobb, the editor of the New York World, which was a really big paper in those days. He was a stalwart supporter of him and the Democratic Party. As Cobb told the story, he rushed to Washington, arriving at the White House at 1 a.m. He and Wilson talked into the dawn. Wilson told Cobb he had, and I quote, considered every loophole to escape going to war, but each time Germany blocked it with some new outrage. Then Wilson began to talk about the impact the war would have on America. Once lead this people into war, the president said, and they'll forget there ever was such a thing as tolerance. To fight, you must be ruthless, and the spirit of ruthless brutality will seize the very fiber of our national life, infecting Congress, the courts, the policeman on the beat, the man in the street. He thought the Constitution would not survive it, Cobb said, that free speech and the right of assembly would go. He said a nation couldn't put its strength into a war and keep its head level. It had never been done. If there's any alternative, for God's sake, let's take it, Wilson exclaimed. Now remember, he's on the eve of going to Congress to give this speech. Well, I couldn't see any, and I told him so, Cobb concluded. This touching scene coincided with another episode I discovered in the memoirs of Woodrow Wilson's secretary, Joseph Tumulty, a man whose name was often spoken with respect in my boyhood home in Jersey City. Tumulty was born not too many blocks from my home. Tumulty told how he and Wilson returned to the White House on that April evening after the president's speech to Congress, calling on America to fight a war without hate, a war to make the world safe for democracy. What a slogan. The soaring rhetoric had been received with near hysterical applause. Tumulty accompanied Wilson to the cabinet room, where the president broke down. My message today was a message of death for our young men, Wilson said. How strange it seems to applaud that. The president launched into an emotional monologue, defending his long struggle to keep America neutral. Finally, Tumulty said he wiped away great tears and, laying his head on the table, sobbed as if he were a child. Here, it would seem, was a double dose of heartbreak combined with globe-girdling drama. I could almost hear the sympathetic sobs of my readers as they turned the opening pages. Alas, additional research led to another variety of heartbreak, the literary kind. These two scenes, which are in numerous biographies of Wilson and histories of World War I, never happened. Wilson, according to the White House logs, Frank Cobb did not set foot in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue on the night of April 1st, nor did Joe Tumulty return to the White House to witness Wilson's supposed breakdown after his speech. The White House keeps extremely good records of who comes in and out the door. What was going on here? It took a lot more research to find the answer. Both these men were Wilson worshipers. They told these stories after the war in a forlorn attempt to make their badly battered hero look good. The grim prophecies Cobb put in Wilson's mouth in 1917 all came true in the next 18 months. A lot of them did, anyway. The war made an appalling mess of the United States, pretty much as his pseudo-Wilson said it would, and it did an even worse job on Wilson's reputation. Several historians have tried to rescue Cobb's tale by transferring it back 2 weeks, when the newsman did visit the president. One went so far as to concede that Cobb may have improved the story a little, but it was essentially true. Ooh, the things that people have gotten away with that word, essentially. In February of 1917, after the United States had broken diplomatic relations with Germany, pioneer Chicago social worker Jane Addams visited the White House to plead for peace. There was a huge peace movement before we declared war. Wilson told her he had decided to intervene in the war in order to secure a seat at the peace conference, where he could argue for a peace of reconciliation and a League of Nations that would make war evil forever. This was not the president created by Cobb, moaning about the dangers of illiberalism and intolerance. This Wilson viewed the declaration of war as a mere transition to the imminent peace conference. He was not in the least worried about it. The scene evoked yet another question in this historian's puzzled head. How come? I found the answer in the congressional record for April 6, 1917, the day after Congress declared war on Germany. That afternoon, Major Palmer S. Pierce of the U.S. Army's General Staff testified before the Senate Finance Committee about the War Department's emergency request for $3 billion. The chairman of the committee, Senator Thomas S. Martin of Virginia, was also the Senate Democratic Majority Leader, which means you would expect him to be in on just about everything. Martin scowled at Pierce and asked him to explain how the Army was going to spend this stupendous sum, the equivalent of perhaps $50 billion in today's money. Pierce began listing how much it would cost to build training camps, buy rifles, artillery, airplanes, and then added nervously, and we may have to send an army to France. Good Lord, Senator Martin said, you're not going to send soldiers over there, are you? Can you believe it? Few comments better exemplify the almost incredible naivete that underlay Americans' decision to declare war on Germany. It was a naivete shared by Woodrow Wilson and his cabinet and just about everyone else in the country. Leading newspapers, such as the New York Tribune and the Los Angeles Times, assured their readers that no American army was needed in France. General Hugh Scott, chief of the Army's general staff, put a memorandum in his files to this effect a month before Congress declared war. Everyone thought the war was as good as won. All the virtually victorious English, French, and Russians needed from the United States was large amounts of food, weapons, and ammunition, paid for by American loans, and some help from the American Navy to fight Germany's troublesome submarines. Needless to say, this assumption also deposits into history's dumpster Joe Tumulty's portrait of Woodrow Wilson sobbing that his speech meant death for countless young Americans. What is the explanation for this incredible misconception? The answer goes back to August 4th, 1914, the day after Great Britain declared war on Germany, a decision, incidentally, that some British historians now lament was the greatest blunder in the history of the empire. At dawn that day, off the German port of Emden, a British ship, the Teleconia, cut a network of undersea cables to New York City. Henceforth, almost all communications between Germany and America had to pass through London, where they were read by British censors. American newsmen reporting the war from Berlin's side of the lines soon learned that their descriptions of Germany's battlefield prowess were cut to ribbons and often suppressed. In 1916, a troubled congressman inserted into the congressional record a complaint from a number of newsmen to this effect. Meanwhile, in Wellington House, not far from Buckingham Palace, the British government had put together a covert propaganda machine employing almost 1,000 people with a separate department dedicated to the United States. They deluged this country with stories puffing British and French battlefield superiority. Speakers by the hundreds toured America telling the same lie. They also devoted a large percentage of their time to making the Germans sound as vicious and evil as possible. They flooded the newspapers with stories of German atrocities against innocent civilians in supposedly neutral Belgium, which the Germans invaded to outflank French fortifications along their eastern border. The Germans attempted to defend themselves by inviting 6 American reporters to travel with their army. They sent a statement home calling the atrocity stories groundless. Undeterred, the British asked well-known historian and diplomat Viscount James Bryce to head a royal commission to investigate the atrocity stories. Bryce and his fellow commissioners supposedly analyzed 1,200 depositions of eyewitnesses who claimed women were regularly raped, while everyone from innocent children to equally innocent 80-year-olds who are frequently massacred by the gray uniformed invaders. The report created a sensation in the United States. New York Times and dozens of other papers declared German atrocities had been proven and denounced the, I quote, premeditated slaughter, end of quotes. The delighted masters of the big lie in Wellington House gleefully informed Price that his report had swept America. After the war, scholars who wanted to examine these depositions were told that they had mysteriously disappeared. A month after the United States declared war, British and French military missions arrived in Washington, D.C. The generals revealed for the first time that the Germans were winning the war. The French army had mutinied, and only 2 divisions were considered reliable. The British army was reeling from stupendous casualties. "We want men, men, men," one French general said. The 2 allies, incidentally, were not speaking to each other. They instead insisted on negotiating separately. The British wanted the Americans to draft 500,000 men and ship them to England, where they would be trained and inserted into English divisions on the Western Front. The French claimed to be somewhat more generous. They too wanted 500,000 men, but they would permit the Americans to come in regiments with their own captains and lieutenants. The rest of the officers would, of course, be French. Fortunately, one man on the American side of these negotiations kept his head. General John J. Pershing convinced Wilson and the Secretary of War that amalgamation with the British and French armies was a terrible idea. Pershing soon sailed for Europe with orders to create a separate army when it arrived from the yet unbuilt training camps. We were totally unprepared for this thing. Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour told Wilson about several secret treaties the Allies had signed with each other, dividing up Turkey's Middle Eastern provinces, Germany's African colonies, and large chunks of Europe and Asia. Wilson's noble war to save democracy suddenly became a war to make the world safe for imperialism. All right, I thought. Wilson was naive, like most Americans, but he could still lead the American people thanks to the power of his oratory. Some years ago, I had read the April 2nd speech to Congress, and he had been deeply impressed by its eloquence. Rereading it, my throat tightened at the soaring last line with its clever play on the famous quotation from Martin Luther, "God help us, we can do no other." At this point in my research, I had the general impression that Congress, after wildly cheering this oratorical masterpiece, voted unanimously for a declaration of war. Imagine my surprise when I again ventured into the congressional record and discovered there were 3 days of often ferocious arguments in which leading liberal senators such as George Norris of Nebraska and Robert La Follette of Wisconsin assailed the president as a hypocrite and a tool of Wall Street's bankers who had loaned so much money to the British we had to go to war to bail them out, which was more or less true, incidentally. "We are putting a $sign on the American flag," Senator Norris roared. La Follette spoke for 4 hours, giving a point-by-point refutation of Wilson's speech filled with scathing denunciations of the president's supposed neutrality. The senator demanded to know why Wilson had allowed American industry to become a branch of the British war machine. Why had he not insisted that Great Britain abandon its blockade of Germany, a genocidal policy that was condemning thousands of German children and elderly to slow death from malnutrition? In the House of Representatives, a congressman from Chicago said a majority were opposed to the war, but lacked the courage to defy the president. He got a burst of applause that shook the chamber. Another congressman said America was being drawn to war by armed plutocracy, crying, "Onward, Christian soldiers." You can't get worse than that. Even more disconcerting was a secret memorandum I discovered describing America's attitude towards the war. It was written a month before the declaration of war. The author was Colonel Edward House, Wilson's foreign policy advisor, and House's close friend, Sir William Wiseman, head of British intelligence in America. How's that like for being in bed with the devil, huh? Its purpose was to give the British government a realistic appraisal of the American political situation. The authors frankly admitted the vast majority of average Americans wanted nothing to do with the war, inadvertently explaining to Wilson why he had been reelected on the slogan in 1916, "He kept us out of war." They also noted a worrisome number of ethnic groups, such as the Irish Americans and, of course, the German Americans, and there were a lot of them, believe me, were hostile to Britain. Only the broader-minded Americans favored intervention. A realistic explanation of broader-minded would be the Anglophiles of the East Coast. Then came even more amazing words. The administration, however, have always been entirely sympathetic to the Allies. They meant the Wilson administration. House and Wiseman showed this document to President Wilson, and he gave it his covert approval. And still he went out and made that speech on April 1st. So much for Woodrow Wilson's repeatedly proclaimed neutrality. Not until the spring of 1918 did enough Americans reach France to form an independent army, a year after we declared war. They played a crucial role in smashing a climactic German offensive aimed at crossing the Marne River and reaching Paris. In 3 horrendously bloody days, the Germans realized they had lost the initiative. If you're not into military history, that's the most crucial thing an army can have in a war. They decide when to attack, when not, and so forth, if you have the initiative. If not, you're on the defensive. One staff officer, a German that is, mournfully confided to his diary that the history of the world had fatally changed in 3 days. 6 months later, with 2 million Americans in France, Berlin asked for an armistice. By now, I was not surprised to learn a war begun with illusions climaxed in yet another illusion, Woodrow Wilson's post-war journey to Paris, with the blithe assumption that everyone would accept him as the savior of Europe, ready and able to persuade the peace conference to approve his January 1918 speech detailing 14 points that would create a world purged of war. This illusion was light years from reality. Prime Minister David Lloyd George of England had campaigned for re-election that fall on the slogan, "Make the Hun pay." French Premier Georges Clemenceau had publicly dismissed Wilson's 14 points. 10 commandments were enough for Moses, but Wilson must have 14, he sneered. Well, he really hated Wilson and vice versa. When the Italians sided with the French and the British in the peace conference, Wilson was reduced to a hapless spectator who could only watch forlornly as the other victors approved clause after clause, dismissing one or all of his 14 points. Wilson made concession after concession to the vengeful demands of the other victors, reducing the final treaty to a virtual travesty of his prescription for a peaceful world. When the editors of the New Republic read the treaty, they gasped that American liberalism had committed suicide. Senator La Follette called it a spoils-grabbing compact of greed and hate. Wilson wanly concurred. As he picked up his pen to sign the final version of the treaty, he said to a nearby spectator, "If I were a German, I wouldn't sign it." Wilson convinced himself that all the treaty's flaws could be fixed by discussions in his grandiose idea for peace, the League of Nations. Back in the United States, with the U.S. Senate, where the midterm elections of 1918 had ensconced a Republican majority, they rejected the treaty and the League. The president undertook a speaking tour to sell the document to the American people. He soon collided with massive resistance within his own Democratic Party. The Irish Americans were especially infuriated with Wilson because he had ignored their pleas to pressure the British into giving Ireland its independence. They'd already had a revolt, as many of you no doubt, in 1916, and there was a semi-civil war raging. In every city, the American Irish took out massive newspaper ads on the day Wilson spoke, calling him a liar and a coward. Toward the end of the nightmarish journey, Wilson suffered a cerebral thrombosis that left him a mental and physical cripple. His wife, Edith, however, browbeat Wilson's physician, Admiral Cary Grayson, into lying about the president's condition. The First Lady, some people call her the First Lady President, as a matter of fact, because she ran the country for about a year. The First Lady claimed the country's top neurologist said it was vital to keep Wilson on the job to stimulate a swift and presumably full recovery in the patient. It took 60 years for the doctor's papers to surface. He actually said the president's recovery would never be more than minimal. At the height of the furor over Wilson's ability to function as president, Edith invited the New York World's White House reporter, Louis Siebold, to be the first newsman to interview the president after his supposed recovery. Edith persuaded Siebold to lie about almost every aspect of the president's condition, from his 60-second attention span to his illegible signature, which Siebold praised as copperplate. Siebold talked about running a foot race with the invalid, whose entire left side remained entirely paralyzed. For a final ironic touch, the newsman won the Pulitzer Prize for this travesty of objective journalism. I like to believe that at times in the United States we're infected by what I call a disease of the public mind, and this whole thing is a classic example. But the truth about Wilson's incapacity kept seeping out, and eventually the American people lost all faith in him. In a desperation move, after the U.S. Senate had twice rejected the treaty, the president announced that the 1920 election would be a great and solemn referendum on the treaty and the League of Nations. The Democratic candidates were Governor James Cox of Ohio and former Assistant Secretary of the Navy Franklin D. Roosevelt of New York. They both followed Wilson's leadership and pleaded for approval of the treaty. It was the approval for approval of the treaty. They lost in one of the greatest landslides in American history. It was the American people who repudiated Woodrow Wilson, not a cabal of conservative Republicans, as too many historians like to claim. What are we to make of this experience almost 100 years later? Should we write off World War I as some sort of bad dream? I think that would be a mistake. World War I happened. We can't make it go away. Perhaps the best way to look at the experience is through the lens of an idea suggested by my good friend, Rutgers historian Lloyd C. Gardner, a covenant with power. Painfully, with mistakes aplenty, in World War I, the United States learned that power, not idealistic principles, is at the heart of history. At the peace conference, Wilson and the United States discovered that self-interest of other strong nations severely limited America's power. Additional limitations resided in the passions and dreams of the masses, perhaps even in human nature itself. When Wilson attempted to appeal to the Italian people over the head of Premier Vittorio Orlando in a dispute over Italy's claim to the city of Fiume, the entire nation denounced the man they had cheered hysterically in the streets of Rome and Milan in 1917. Still more limitations lay in the illusions of idealism, the expectation that slogans can easily be translated into meaningful realities. Nevertheless, idealism has remained a crucial compound of the American covenant with power, but it has always been combined with an often brutal, pragmatic realism. I call this the great dichotomy. It runs through American history like a tangled, sometimes bloody thread. In any application of this covenant with power, success will never be total, nor will it ever win unanimous agreement on a domestic political scene where politicians of the opposite party will be quick, often too quick, to criticize. But the free society of South Korea, the independent Philippines, the democracies of Germany and Japan, and the free nations of Eastern Europe are proof that this unique American instrument can become a creative force in a peaceful world. There's another side to World War I that I barely mentioned in this narrative of the follies of the leaders, the heroism of the men. I learned this from my father, who was a sergeant in the 78th Division, trained at Fort Dix, and fought in all the major battles. Unfortunately, I did a lot of research before I came over here, and I found out he didn't leave for France from Hoboken, the Brooklyn Rail Terminal. Don't ask me why, but that's a fact, apparently. Anyway, he fought, as I said, in all the major battles from St. Mihiel to the Argonne. He was made a lieutenant in the closing weeks of the Argonne when the officers in his company were all dead or wounded. More than once he told me that he admired the doughboys who won medals, but he admired even more the men who had done heroic things without winning even a citation. What were these things, I asked. I was a young kid at the time. Mostly it was trying to save a wounded buddy, he told me. On the wall of my bedroom, on the wall of his bedroom, my father, one of the least sentimental men I ever met, he was what you call a tough Mick, had a framed copy of the poem, My Buddy. Even as a boy, I couldn't read it without tears clouding my eyes. Who was it met me with a smile and stayed beside me all the while and helped me o'er each weary mile? My buddy. Who used to help me out at drill and sat and talked when I was ill, who carried my pack up many a hill? My buddy. Who used to cheer me with his song when everything was going wrong, whose faults were short and friendship long? My buddy. Whose name is ever in my heart, who makes the tears off want to start, who from me even death can't part? My buddy. As you can see, I still can't read it without crying. Another voice we should not forget, belongs to General John J. Pershing. He lacked the charisma of a MacArthur or an Eisenhower. As a general, he relied on discipline and toughness. One junior officer said Pershing's favorite biblical figure was Joshua because he made the sun and the moon stand at attention. He made little or no attempt to win his men's affection. Journalist Hayward Broun wrote that no one would ever call him Papa Pershing. That they call one of the French generals that. When he spoke at all, it was laconic, blunt. But there were times when this style said a great deal. On Armistice Night, in his hotel room in Paris, Pershing raised a glass and said, "To the men, they were willing to pay the price." There are volumes of pain and loss and heroism and sacrifice in those words. They're an invisible confession that for the first 3 months at least of when we were in action in France, we had the wrong strategy. We attacked machine guns head on. It's just not to be believed, the mistakes that we made. Officially, 108,000 Americans died in our 6 months of combat. But I took the trouble to call the Veterans Administration, who informed me that by 1930, the number had risen to 450,000. Poison gas and exploding artillery shells inflicted terrible damage on thousands of doughboys, cruelly shortening their lives. Only once, when Pershing was about to return to the United States, did he speak with what we might call the voice of the heart. On Memorial Day, 1919, he went to the Argonne Cemetery, where 14,200 Americans still lie. Gazing out at this sea of white crosses, Pershing said, "It is not for us to proclaim what they did. Their silence speaks more eloquently than words. But it is from us to uphold the concept of duty, honor, country, the great West Point motto, for which they fought and for which they died. It is for the living to carry forward that purpose and make fruitful their sacrifice. And now, dear comrades, farewell. Here, under the clear skies, on the green hillsides, and amid the flowering fields of France, in the quiet hush of peace, we leave you forever in God's hands." In my visits to France, while researching this book, I too found the Argonne Cemetery a source of deep emotion. It underscored the importance of the covenant with power that has emerged as my chief reason for rethinking the Great War. As I gazed out at those white crosses, I could only hope that the men who guide America's destiny in the world of the 21st century will have the courage and the wisdom to manage our often perplexing blend of idealism and realism in the cause of world peace. God helping us, we can now do no other. Thank you very much. Sure.
We have time for some questions. If anybody wants to ask Tom Fleming, our historian, anything after that wonderful talk, not just full of scholarship, but full of heart. We're also going to be passing out our surveys, so if you would take the time to fill them out. We have the book. We have Mr. Fleming's book is available here, so if you'd like a copy, he'll be happy to autograph it for you.
Sure.
So if there's any questions?
Yeah.
Yes?
Thank you for the wonderful talk. Why were the boys called the doughboys? Did you say doughboys?
Why is what?
Why were they called doughboys?
Oh, doughboys.
Flower on there?
There's a great deal of dispute about that name. They first, well, the Europeans called them Yankees, and then everybody sort of agreed, yeah, doughboys, but I really can't explain why.
Could you say just a little bit about your passing remark that post-war British historians have reassessed the advisability, the wisdom of entering World War I?
Did I say that they were questioning whether we should have invaded,
Whether the Brits should have.
or whether the British joined the war? Yeah, that's some British historians have commented that they didn't have to join the war. You know, one of the things that one of the phoniest things about the whole thing is the British announced that they were going to come in the war because the Germans had attacked Belgium, a wonderful little neutral country. The Belgians were about as neutral as the premier of France. The French had a saying. After they sent men into, they did most of the fighting when the Germans invaded Belgium, and the French used to say that there's no doubt about it, the Belgians will continue to resist as long as there's a French soldier in Belgium. and speaking of that, I was interested I thought you might like to hear more about the antagonism between the French and the British. They really disliked each other. They had street riots between British and French officers in Paris. They really literally hated each other. Well, they had fought in previous centuries, you know, as enemies. And a lot of them just couldn't get used to it. And also, a great many of them were accusing one side or the other of holding back men and letting the other guys do the fighting. And the collapse of the French army is really an amazing story. It's never been really told. They were, as I said in the speech, they were down to 2 divisions that they could rely on. And when the Americans were moving up to resist the Germans on the Marne, they were passed by hundreds, perhaps even thousands, of fleeing French soldiers who screamed at the Americans, "La war is fini." How's that for encouraging news as you go in to risk your neck? So it's a complicated story, but I think it's a great story that we should all try to understand as intelligently as possible, I think, you know. I'm not poo-pooing it. I think we had to go into this thing because by the time we did go in, and the attempt for a 1916 peace conference had failed, the Germans had been, extreme German politicians had taken over Germany. And they did have grandiose talk of taking over. By this time, incidentally, Russia had dropped out of the war. So there was several prominent Germans got dreams of glory. They were going to take a big chunk of Russia, a big chunk of France, Belgium, of course, and just become twice as big a country as they were already. But this was an illusion inflicted by the terrible agonies and sacrifices of the war. My father told me a story I'll never forget. They were up in the lines at St. Mihiel, and they used to raid each other, you know, in the middle of the night. And this one night, they raided a German regiment on the other side of no man's land, and it was a bloody battle. And they shot a couple of people, and they grabbed a German officer who, and he was badly wounded. They shot him. They dragged him back to their side of the lines, and 3 or 4 or 5 of his men went with him. And this man, all that night, he slowly died. And his men knelt beside him, praying to God to spare him. They wept like children. My father said he never saw the intensity of feelings for an officer in the American Army, or the British Army for that matter, but he did see it then, and it gave him a new respect for how the Germans were trained to fight a war. They really did have a fantastic army, there's no doubt about it. Yes, Nick.
I'm always fascinated, I've been fascinated by Wilson's collapse at the 1919 peace treaty.
Yes.
I mean, he just gave in on everything.
Yeah.
I know Mitchell wrote a book on 1919, not Mitchell, what's her name? McMillan.
Oh, yeah,
About
yeah.
1919, where she said that he got the Spanish flu.
Yeah.
And that affected his. What do you make of his complete capitulation to the European leaders?
He was alone. He really was alone. And one of the things I concluded from listening to and studying Wilson for quite a while was that these abstract ideas that he floated, they weren't convictions. He didn't believe passionately in them. His whole goal was to write a speech that would leave everybody legless, just about. And so these so-called principles that he was spinning out there, he didn't have that much faith in them. He really didn't. And so you'd have to grow up, as I did, in Jersey City. My father was not very interested in history, I assure you. He was leader of the 6th Ward, and that gave him all he needed to do. I got one more quick story. Hoboken will appreciate this. The first time I met Frank Hague, we were coming out of Roosevelt Stadium, and they just played an opening day baseball game. And my father took me by the hand. I was 7 years old, and he walked me around a few cars, and there was the mayor getting in his car. And my father said, "Mayor, I'd like you to meet my son." The mayor looked down at me like he'd caught me scalping box seats tickets. He put out his hand and he mashed my fingers to an absolute pulp. And then he leaned down and said, "Your old man is a hell of a guy." From that time on, I voted the straight ticket. You couldn't get me to change it. Now, that's politics. Yes, sir. Right.
As a historian,
Yeah.
Hi. I'm absolutely floored that you said the U.S. had no comprehension of how the war was going, that they really thought the Allies were winning. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes. That ship I mentioned that cut all those lines, they were the undersea cable lines for the Germans, and that's where they sent all their information to America and Canada, South America. That was gone once they cut those, and they had to send everything through England, and the British were ruthless about censoring it and so forth. And the Americans never really got down to telling the people. The newspaper men didn't want to admit that they were being censored and so forth. So it never became a public issue. They thought it was too embarrassing to bring up that they didn't really have control of their stories. And so one thing led to another, and was basically the whole thing remained silence for the whole war. But it was a very serious, shall we say, mistake on the part of the British to try to make it all one-sided that way. Yes, sir, one more in the back before I collapse.
Zimmerman affair, this rumor that Mexico was supposed to invade the United States, there was a letter from Zimmerman. What was that whole Zimmerman story? You know about that?
The Zimmerman story?
Zimmerman telegram.
Oh, the Zimmerman telegram. The Zimmerman telegram occurred before World War II began. World War I began. It was a telegram that the British intercepted because they had access to all the undersea cable lines and so forth, and it offered Mexico a treaty if the Mexicans would start a war with America. The British and the French would make them partners in the peace. And at first Wilson hesitated to put it out there, to release it, and then he did, and it caused huge anger and uproar in America. And there's no doubt about it that the Germans had a big secret apparatus in this country too, and the perfect example of that, of course, is Black Tom, which I'm sure broke a few windows here in Hoboken as well as in Jersey City. In fact, it's one of the memorable stories of my youth. I was told that when the Black Tom exploded, it was only about a half a mile from our house. This little island just absolutely stuffed with high-powered shells and dynamite and God knows what. And windows were smashed all over New York, and in Jersey City, practically every window was broken. And my grandfather, David Fleming, who incidentally couldn't read or write, he born in County Mayo, God help us. He got up, he leaped out of bed and ran into the dining room, ran into the kitchen where the table was set for breakfast. And the plates were dancing all over the table and so forth. And he grabbed the table, and other members of the family came out, and there he was yelling, "Save the dishes, save the dishes." The world was blowing up, and he was trying to save those dishes. Oh, thanks again.